and welcome to today's webinar on strategies for close reading. My name is Leslie Zaroya, and I'm a Reading Language Arts consultant here at the Los Angeles County Office of Education. Today, we'll take a look at why close reading is such a valuable skill for our students. We'll also examine criteria for selecting close read-worthy texts, as not every piece of text works with this particular strategy. Then we'll figure out how close reading can be facilitated, how to lead students through a process so they can learn to be analytical readers on their own. We will also take a look at a short classroom video and see what it might look like in action, and then end with a few considerations that relate to close reading with elementary students. Okay, so here we go. As you know, close reading is a huge component of the Common Core state standards. In order to attain mastery of the standards, students must read closely. With the instructional shifts in Common Core and the additional emphasis on complex texts, academic vocabulary, and informational text, students must have tools with which to navigate. It is no longer enough to just offer personal reflections and opinions about the text at hand. The Common Core requires evidence and justification for the conclusions and inferences drawn. This demands an active learner, one who can ask deeper questions and navigate text in meaningful ways. There is no room for passivity in Common Core. Close reading is also an excellent process for building academic stamina and persistence. Students sometimes look at what they perceive as a difficult text and give up before they begin. The tools that close reading offers help students to practice and develop better reading habits. This also relates to higher level thinking skills. If students are ever only asked lower level comprehension questions, that's what they will learn to deal with. Close reading demands higher level thinking, and practicing it leads to success and better skills. And finally, with the digital age comes a staggering amount of information that we all slog through every day. Students need the skills to be discerners. They need to know how to both efficiently sift through text and also dig deeply into text. No easy task, but it is definitely one we can chip away at. So what do I really mean when I talk about the strategy of close reading? Well, essentially it means that we read to uncover layers of meaning. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. It involves looking beyond the surface level of the big ideas or the general plot or main characters. With each read, another layer is uncovered and another angle of the text explored. The ultimate goal of this, of course, is a level of deep understanding and comprehension of the text. So it requires then that we examine the meaning thoroughly, looking closely at text for, yes, central or main ideas and details, but also going all the way down to the sentence and sometimes even word level to see how ideas are developed in the text. So the question then becomes, how do we know if a text is worthy of a close read? It really comes down to the notion of text complexity. Is there enough heft to the text in any of the following areas? With knowledge demands, we're looking at the content itself. Is it new? Is it complex? With text structure, it might be that the layout of the text is interesting or unfamiliar. Reading a vignette is completely different from reading a poem or a news article, so that may play a role in deciding if it warrants a close read. The next consideration is layers or levels of meaning. If the text is fairly straightforward, then there really isn't much to dig deeper into. And finally, another element might be language style or conventions that warrant a deeper look. If the language is filled with dialect or imagery or some other literary device, maybe the close read would focus in on that and how it impacts the tone, plot, or sequence of events. So again, a text does not need to have all of these criteria, but these are just a few features to consider when selecting a text. Obviously then, the opposite is true for deciding when not to close read. If the content is fairly straightforward and the structure and vocabulary are not overly demanding, I'd say pass. The goal in leading students through close reading is to teach them how to uncover the layers of meaning, and ultimately, if there's only one layer, it falls rather flat. Okay, so I'm throwing this in here because as is the case with every experience in the classroom, the teacher is a huge factor in how well things go. If the teacher has really delved into the text ahead of time and can identify what will be difficult for students, the lesson is going to go much further than if it was done in tandem with the students. One teacher told me, well, I don't like to overly think it ahead of time, so we can kind of explore it together, and it feels authentic. I guess I get that on some level, but honestly, it's not really about the teacher having an authentic experience. In my mind, it's about facilitating a process that helps students become confident in their ability to deconstruct text. And the best way to do that is to be really prepared for the lesson by having concrete tasks for each read-through and having questions ready that lead to deeper analysis. More on that in a minute. Okay, so here are a few key features of close reading, and we're going to go through each one for just a minute. They include short passages, complex texts, limited front-loading, repeated readings, text-dependent questions, and annotations. Let's start with short passages. The reason that this is first is because it's really important, especially when you first begin training students in analytical reading. The passage you choose must be short but meaty. There has to be enough content to have something to work with, but not so much that it is completely overwhelming and students give up before they even begin. When I first begin training students to close read, I like to start with just 1 or 2 paragraphs. This is intentional, so students can reread quickly and have success in accomplishing the task for that particular read-through. Later, the passages can be longer, but in the beginning, you want to build some success and make the task doable. Doug Fisher likes to say that if the paper with the text has a staple, then the reading is too long for close reading. Choose a section of it instead. Which leads us to the next one. Complex text. As I mentioned before, there's got to be something interesting about the text that makes it quote-unquote fun, and I say this in quotes for lack of a better word. It needs to have a hook that draws the reader in and raises questions or makes you stop and say, what? What was that? What did he just say or do or explain? This can take many forms. It can be that the language is really significant. Maybe there's dialect, or it's very flowery in description, or even just dense, filled with academic terminology that needs to be dissected. It can also be a stylistic element. Maybe the structure of the text is unfamiliar, like a vignette, poem, or pamphlet. And finally, as we have discussed here, the content has to have layers of meaning. If it's pretty straightforward and one-dimensional, the close read will fall flat. There needs to be either some ambiguity or absolute conclusiveness to dissect, discuss, and debate. Okay, next is limited front-loading, and this one is really hard for teachers. For a long time, we've been very concerned with building background knowledge and making sure students could immediately relate and connect to the material. This is still relevant to some degree with Common Core instruction. The trick, though, is to not give away the farm. We need to feed just enough to get their attention or lay a foundation without doing all of the heavy lifting for them. I know you're probably annoyed with this, but hear me out. If we continue to do all the heavy lifting, who gets the big muscles? We do, and we already have big reading muscles. So let's save the heavy lifting, the discovering, the questioning, the analyzing for the kids. Let's let them build some amazing reading muscles. This allows there to be room to grapple, to struggle, to not know right away what may be going on, but to persevere in spite of that. I feel really strongly about this one because I think we now live in a culture where everything is pretty much easy and quick, and kids are used to having it their way and right now. So when they're confronted with complex text, their inclination is to just sit back and wait it out, meaning they will wait for you to explain it and give the Cliff Notes version. We have to stop doing this. The intention has always been well-meaning, but the end product has sort of backfired. So if we can step back, Leave space for a little confusion, some questions about the text. There will be room and opportunity to do some discovery and dig deeply into the material. Okay, enough of my soapbox on front loading. Let's go on to repeated reading. This can be another sticky wicket with students in the beginning. Kids are not necessarily fond of anything, rewriting, redoing, revising. Not on their top 5 list of faves, to be sure. So the trick is to make each read seem absolutely new and crucial. How do you do that? Well, one way is to give very clear, concrete tasks for each read. I like to start with a get the gist reading. This is just a read aloud or silent read of the material and a quick debrief of what's going on. What's the big idea? The second read then starts to go a bit deeper and has a task that gets at general understanding. The third read would laser in on some detail or text feature that has significance in the material. And each consecutive read after that might target a specific detail or element. There are two critical features of all of this. One is to make sure that the task is concrete and clear. Any ambiguity in what they are looking for will kill their motivation. And the second is to debrief after each and every one. Students need to hear from others and share their own ideas and processes. If this step is skipped, again, the close read may fail. It is imperative to discuss and share ideas so students can see how others work through text and to learn how to discern which arguments and conclusions are valid and which are not. Okay, next is text-dependent questions. The notion of text-dependent questions is very important in close reading as it keeps students anchored in the text. When teachers sort of let the questions roll with the reading and ask students whatever comes to mind as they read, the focus tends to be on things like personal connections. What did you think of that? Or have you ever had that happen? Or sometimes the questions are low level. What's happening here? What did the characters do? Not that this is bad. We definitely want kids connecting with texts and make sure they are comprehending on a basic level. That is step 1 in the process. The issue becomes when the questions stay at that level. Also, the type of question you ask will influence how students read the text. If they are asked a lot of recall questions, they get used to answering recall questions, so they look for the basic facts as they read. If they know you tend to ask questions that are deeper in nature, they will be trained to look deeper for answers. High-level text-dependent questions require students to make inferences and draw conclusions about what they are reading and look carefully for evidence in the reading. There are many types of text-dependent questions that get at a variety of angles in a text, as you can see on the slide. The trick here is to not get mired in questions that are low level. Teachers sometimes are so focused on making sure that the question is anchored in the text that they get stuck in DOK level 1 questions that are too literal and can easily be located in the text. If you look in the resources tab, I've attached a resource, 100 text-dependent question stems that I found online. I'm not sure who put it together, but it's a fabulous resource. So make sure you take a look and share with others. No need to reinvent the wheel here, people. Finally, annotation is an essential component of analytical reading. It's basically reading with a pencil and marking ideas and questions directly on the text. I know I couldn't have gotten through college without writing in my books or using Post-its. Unfortunately, in our traditional K-12 public school system, writing in books has always been considered a no-no. There are ways to get around this, and we really need to strive to do this so students can have opportunities to interact directly on the text itself. Some teachers use Post-it notes or a graphic organizer. Some lay a transparency over the text and have students write on that as an overlay. I like to retype small sections on a separate paper and space it out a bit so students have room to annotate freely. Some teachers like to have a system of annotations, symbols that they train students to use as they read, like a question mark for a place that is confusing, or an exclamation mark for an idea that is interesting and you want to revisit. How complex the system becomes really depends on the grade level you teach and how experienced students are with annotating. In early elementary, I think young students could certainly use simple symbols to mark the text. I would keep it to just a few, especially in the early stages of learning to close read. As students gain experience, I would expand this beyond symbols. It's important to be able to sort of see their thinking as they annotate, and just seeing symbols does not necessarily articulate a lot of that. Also, a key reason to annotate is to gather evidence for use later, for writing or discussing or debating. It's so much easier if you have already marked key points and passages. Take a look at this sample from a 4th grade student reading about the life of Thomas Edison. The focus question was, why was Thomas Edison unusual? The key at the top indicates that there are 3 symbols to use as they read. One for questions, one for interesting ideas, and one for evidence that supports their answer to the focus question. When you look closely at the markings made, it's interesting to see that his evidence is pretty on point as to why Edison is unusual. Which brings up another point. Annotating is a way for the teacher to peek into the student's mind as they read to see where they are on track or off. So let's take a look at how a 9th grade teacher uses annotation as a way of getting initial impressions and understandings of the text from students. If you're watching this on the archive, feel free to take a minute to discuss what you saw on that short clip. But for our purposes live, what I noticed was by using the thinking notes as their sort of pre-read into the material, as this was a homework assignment, it allowed them to come into class and jump right in with impressions and questions. It was also a way to generate interesting discussion right off the bat with something concrete. Teachers sometimes get discouraged and feel like students aren't willing to participate in the sort of grand literary discussion. Often it is because they do not know what to say. So having some sort of written close read notes draws out plenty of questions, ideas, and challenges to chew on. So let's look at another example of a close reading protocol. In the Resources tab, you will find a clean copy of the reading Salvador, Late or Early, as well as the final marked copy you will see in a minute. Feel free to download those now if you haven't already. So with this text, students had 4 reads of the 2 short paragraphs, and the overarching question was, who is Salvador? This particular vignette is great for close reading because it uses a lot of imagery in complex ways, and the structure's a bit odd. Lots of long sentences, but they're in fragments. The other great piece is that it leaves room for debate as to who Salvador might be. Is he happy, sad? A case could be made either way. So again, the overarching question was, who is Salvador? And for the first read, it was just, what's going on here? What did you get about Salvador? You can see the annotations focused on literal descriptions: green eyes, messy hair, wrinkled shirt. In the second read, we move to, now read for clues about his character. Make some inferences about him based on the clues. So the student noticed Sal is rather forgettable. His teacher doesn't remember his name, and he is responsible because he helps his siblings. And it goes a little deeper as he makes some inferences from the clues. In the third read, they were asked to decide if Salvador is happy or sad based on the clues in the text. So our guy chose sad and was able to offer evidence that Sal is no one's friend, seems nervous and apologetic, has a history of hurt, and a guitar of grief. Even though the color coding is not necessary with each read, I kind of actually like it because then kids could also see their layers of thinking unfolding with each read. It's just another way to go about it, but not a must. So for the final read, they zeroed in on the author's use of imagery and the impact it has on the picture we get of Salvador. It's getting a little messy, but you can see the pink highlighted areas are reflective of imagery, and at the bottom of the page, the conclusion is that imagery sets the tone, and he chose the words cracked, raw, bad weather, feathers and rags, elbows crisscrossed as part of the evidence. Next would be the time to use all of that analysis and engage students in discussion and debate and some sort of writing activity so they can demonstrate the understanding they gained from the analysis. Students would ultimately write to the focus question of who is Salvador and use the notes they have made to provide evidence to support their claim. Okay, so this is another tool, a different close reading protocol, and it's in the resources tab below if you'd like to download it. It outlines a 10-step process for conducting a structured close read. They are fairly straightforward, so let's go through it. Number 1 is number the paragraphs. Number 2, chunk the text by breaking it into sections. Number 3 is to read multiple times, each with a purpose. Number 4 is to underline and circle with a purpose, meaning that you designate, let's say, underline means a claim, and circle means evidence, or underline metaphors and circle the similes. Number 5 is called left margin. So in the left margin, students write, what is the author saying? What's the point or the gist? So it's rather literal, what's going on. Number 6 is in the right margin, they dig deeper and ask questions. Number 7, students describe what the author is saying and doing and tell why it is important. There are verbs provided here as well to help scaffold that part. Finally, they examine the text in terms of Common Core strands. They look at the structure, key ideas, vocabulary, etc. And then in number 9, it's time to put all of that together. They capture their ideas and use a graphic organizer or Post-its or some other method of sort of putting it together. And then in number 10, they summarize and synthesize what they have learned. This is a great protocol for beginners to close reading, and I'm referring to both teachers who are new to teaching it and also to students, as it's very structured and can teach many skills in sort of a organized and structured way. Here's an example of the 10-step protocol with the very same reading we looked at before on Salvador. So you can see the paragraphs are numbered and chunked. Underlinings are of the physical descriptions of Sal. Circles are of emotional descriptions. In the left margin, it gives the gist of each paragraph. And on the right margin, it goes deeper, making inferences. Notes at the bottom indicate what the author is doing, in this case, using imagery to paint a complex picture of the boy. Highlighting shows evidence. So while the process is a little different than the previous close read technique, it really gets at similar things. The trick is to be clear as the facilitator in which direction you are leading students and what features you wish to highlight. Okay, before we close, just a few considerations regarding younger students. First of all, close reading is absolutely appropriate in elementary classrooms, and pretty much the same guidelines apply that we have outlined here today. Where it differs is in a few key areas. One is K-3. Because students are still engaged in actually learning to read, the first read-through would have to be as a read aloud by the teacher or a shared reading. It is also important in these early grades to be very mindful of the cognitive demand we are placing on students all at once. Since these younger ones are learning the mechanics of reading, we don't want to layer too many skills in one sitting. The close read may need to occur over several days, with skills progressing as the content becomes very familiar. Also, the front loading may need to be expanded based on the demands of the content. If the content is very unfamiliar, it may require that the teacher do a little more background building before launching in on analysis. And finally, modeling is really important. It is at all grades, but especially in the younger grades when you are first starting analytical reading. They need to explicitly see how the teacher does it and have some guided practice to feel comfortable in tackling it themselves.